From the outside, everything looks fine. You have a job, your health, people who care about you. By all accounts, you should feel okay. And yet a persistent, low-grade sense of wrongness hums in the background of daily life. It's not a crisis or a breakdown, but a dull numbness, exhaustion without cause, as cultural theorist Mark Fisher described, an unease that something about reality is slightly off. Crucially, this feeling is hard to name or justify. There's no obvious tragedy to point to, just the haunting sense that you're living in a version of your life that's almost right, but isn't. Modern culture often treats such disconnection as a personal problem. Stress, burnout, too much screen time, with personal solutions, therapy, self-care, gratitude journaling. But what if the problem isn't just in you at all? Fisher argues this diffuse malaise is not a personal failing. It is a rational response to living in a world that promises endless pleasure while quietly hollowing out the capacity to feel it. Infinite pleasure, diminished joy, hedonic depression. Fisher coined the term hedonic depression, or depressive hedonia, to capture this paradox of our times. Unlike classic depression of the past, often marked by sorrow or the inability to experience pleasure at all, hedonic depression is characterized by being able to seek and obtain pleasure endlessly, yet finding no real satisfaction or meaning in it. In Fisher's words, depression is usually characterized as a state of anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure. But the condition I'm referring to is constituted not by an inability to get pleasure, so much as by an inability to do anything except pursue pleasure. There is a sense that something is missing, but no appreciation that this mysterious missing enjoyment can only be accessed beyond the pleasure principle. In other words, you can binge watch, scroll, snack, and shop to your heart's content. Nothing stops you from indulging, yet each dopamine hit feels emptier than the last. The result is a strangely hollow normalcy, a life full of activities and stimuli that nonetheless leaves you feeling disengaged and indifferent. Common signs of this hedonic depression include emptiness amid abundance. You consume entertainment, food, or social media for hours and come away feeling nothing. Pleasure is fleeting and doesn't translate into lasting joy or fulfillment. Life is a blur of distractions. There's always something new to watch, click, or buy, keeping you continually occupied but never sated. You sense that you're passing time rather than truly living, as if you're there but not present. Moments that should feel meaningful fall flat. A vacation feels like a photo shoot opportunity. A celebration feels like you're performing happiness. A conversation with a loved one only half holds your attention because another part of you is already composing how this will look later. You're doing all the right things, but the authentic feeling doesn't arrive. Fisher argues this is not laziness or ingratitude. It's the predictable outcome of a society that commodifies every human experience and packages it for consumption. When every moment of rest is reframed as a chance to recharge for productivity, when friendships become networking and personal passions morph into content, something in our emotional texture thins out. Life turns into a series of tasks and consumable experiences, optimized and monetized at every turn. The machinery of this system runs smoothly. You function, you produce, you consume. But what's lost is the feeling of being alive while doing so. As Fisher observed, capitalism succeeds in creating infinite forms of desire while limiting the potential for satisfaction, leading to a constant state of disappointment in denial, a cultural malaise of promised pleasures that never fulfill. Hedonic depression, in this sense, is not a personal malfunction at all, but evidence that something about our way of life is fundamentally misaligned with our deeper capacity for joy. Capitalist realism and the lost future. Why does this numb discontent feel so pervasive and hard to escape? Fisher's answer begins with what he calls capitalist realism, the widespread sense that capitalism is not only the dominant economic system, but the only feasible reality. We live in an atmosphere where it's become, as the saying goes, easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Alternatives to the status quo feel impossible to envision. History seems to have stalled out at the end of history. This has profound psychological effects. Older generations, at least in the post-war era, carried an implicit belief that tomorrow could be better than today, that progress was real, and their children might live in an improved world. In contrast, those coming of age now often harbor a near certainty that the future will be harder or smaller, not brighter. Climate change isn't a distant possibility. It's a looming inevitability. Stable careers, affordable homes, secure retirements, the basic social contracts that once structured adult life, have frayed or vanished. In Fisher's terms, the future has been effectively canceled. This brings us to hauntology, a concept Fisher adapts from Derrida to describe how we are haunted by futures that never arrived. In a culture of capitalist realism, we are surrounded not just by nostalgia for the past, but by nostalgia for the lost future, the futures that were promised and never delivered. The jetpacks, utopias, and social progress we dreamed of as the 21st century failed to materialize. Instead, we inherited crisis and repetition. Fisher notes that the past keeps returning because the future has been canceled. What haunts us is not the past per se, but the futures it was supposed to deliver. We find ourselves stuck in cultural rewind, endless reboots, retro fashions, recycled memes from decades ago, as if newness itself has died. This slow cancellation of the future, as Fisher calls it, breeds a pervasive sense of belatedness, a feeling that we're living after the golden age, that nothing truly new or better is on the way. The psychological toll of losing the idea of a future is immense. That diffuse grief you feel, the ache for a world that should have been, is real grief, even if no one around you recognizes it. Society has rituals and language for mourning tangible losses, people, places, past chapters of life, but no ritual for mourning a future that failed to arrive. You end up carrying that sorrow quietly, blaming yourself for feeling sad about nothing. When this sadness surfaces as apathy or disconnection, you're told you have a bad attitude or lack imagination. In truth, as Fisher unsparingly points out, the collapse of the future is not a mood, it's a political condition. The system we live in, one that cannot imagine its own end, has no stake in your future, only in your present consumption. With no actionable future to look toward, the present flattens into an exitless now, a looping treadmill of maintenance and crisis management. It's no wonder that motivation, hope, and meaning wither. Under capitalist realism, even time and imagination have been colonized. The hollow numbness that there's no future isn't a personal cynicism. It's an accurate reading of a world that has, in a very real way, stopped moving forward. Life is content, the collapse of the real. One of the more unsettling symptoms of this condition is how reality itself starts to feel unreal. Perhaps you've noticed it in yourself. You're at dinner with friends or watching a beautiful sunset, but you're not fully there. It's not that you're completely dissociated. It's more like you're observing your life at a slight remove, as if an invisible screen stands between you and the moment. Fisher's diagnosis of this phenomenon goes beyond blaming phone addiction or a distracted mind. He argues that in late capitalism, experience is so thoroughly mediated and commodified that it ceases to feel authentic. We live our lives and simultaneously produce a record of living. By now, it's almost second nature to view each experience with one eye toward how it appears to an audience, even if the audience is just our own social media presence. It has become an invisible new contract where life only feels real if someone else is watching. In other words, the self that exists unobserved is being systematically starved. French philosopher Jean Baudrillard warned of this blurring of reality and representation decades ago, and today it's glaringly evident. We increasingly inhabit simulacra, copies and performances for which no authentic original may exist. Consider how often we do things for the photo or choose an outing because it's Instagrammable. As one commentator put it, so many of our experiences are no longer lived for what they are, but for how they'll appear. You go to a popular scenic spot and find crowds taking the same picture. It hardly matters whether the place itself is enjoyable, only that it serves as shareable content. In a striking real-life example, a writer describes visiting a street simply because it had gone viral on Instagram, spending 15 minutes taking posed photos, then realizing we hadn't been in a real place, but in a simulation of one, an empty representation, disconnected from any original meaning, perpetuated only because others had validated it first. This is Baudrillard's hyperreality in action. The copy becomes more real, more relevant than the original. The street's only value was as a backdrop for online imagery. The real hasn't disappeared, but it has ceased to be relevant. The result is a peculiar form of detachment. When every emotion or experience automatically spawns a post or a story, we start feeling that our joy has become a story about joy, our grief a post about grief. Life is perpetually viewed through a frame. Fisher calls this the collapse of the real. When reality arrives pre-filtered, pre-packaged, and optimized for consumption, it no longer feels like reality. Authentic presence, being immersed in a moment for its own sake, becomes increasingly elusive. It even feels uncomfortable, like, shouldn't I be capturing this? Doing something with it? This induces a deep loneliness and disorientation that have little to do with physically being alone. You can be surrounded by friends and still feel not really there, a spectator to your own life. Many have noted this strange loneliness in the middle of things that should matter, a sense of not having truly arrived anywhere, even as you go through the motions. It stems from a loss of any unmediated self. When every moment is performed, curated, or viewed through an audience's eyes, what's left of you when the audience goes away? The quiet self, the one that exists when you're not performing, has withered from disuse. And the culture of constant performance is so normalized that we hardly remember what it felt like to live without it. Personal blame for structural problems. If all this paints a bleak picture of systemic causes, why do so many of us still feel like we are the problem? Here we come to what Fisher calls one of neoliberalism's cruelest tricks, the privatization of stress and suffering. In a competitive, hyper-individualized society, every failure or hardship is framed as personal inadequacy. Struggling to pay rent in an unforgiving housing market? You must have made poor choices, should have worked harder, saved more. Stressed and burned out at your job? Learn resilience, practice self-care. You need to better manage your work-life balance. Depressed or anxious about the state of the world? That's a you problem. Maybe a chemical imbalance in your brain, treatable with therapy and meds. In short, systemic crises are handed back to individuals as private burdens to solve. Fisher notes how our era systematically encourages the belief that anyone can succeed if they try hard enough. So, if you do not succeed, there is only one person to blame. This mindset conveniently erases the larger forces at play, like decades of wage stagnation or skyrocketing inequality, and leaves us marinating in shame. After all, if everyone else seems to be coping and hustling, the problem must be your own laziness, incompetence, or negativity, right? Fisher called this systemic individualization, turning impersonal problems into personal failings. It's highly effective social control. Shame isolates people. You can't unite in protest around a feeling that you interpret as your own private shame. So long as you blame yourself, you won't blame the system. For example, consider rising mental distress. Under capitalist realism, the official line is that mental illness is purely a chemical or individual pathology, treatable by adjusting your mindset or neurotransmitters, never a response to economic or social conditions. As Fisher observes, this chemico-biologization of mental health is no accident. It is strictly commensurate with its depoliticization. Declaring depression to be a serotonin imbalance isn't wrong, biologically speaking, but it stops us from asking why so many people's brains are running low on serotonin in the first place. Such a narrative has enormous benefits for capitalism, Fisher notes. It reinforces an atomized view of individuals. You're sick because of your faulty brain chemistry, not because of precarious livelihoods or social breakdown. And it opens up lucrative markets for pharmaceuticals and self-help industries to cure you. Meanwhile, the larger causes, the cage we all live in, remain unexamined and untouched. As Fisher bluntly puts it, many of those suffering under this system are effectively casualties of capital. They are people psychologically damaged as a consequence of the capitalist realist insistence on certain harsh economic policies and unstable conditions. Yet rather than acknowledge these casualties and the need for structural change, society more often dismisses them as malingerers or individual weaklings. To illustrate this individualization, consider a few examples common in modern life. Work and burnout. Jobs increasingly demand total availability and ever higher performance. When workers crack under these pressures, the narrative is that they aren't resilient enough or lack proper time management. The proposed fixes, mindfulness training, wellness apps, life hacks, focus on personal optimization rather than questioning exploitative workloads or the erosion of labor rights. Burnout becomes an individual diagnosis instead of an indictment of work culture. Economic insecurity. Sky-high rents, gig economy jobs with no benefits, and mounting debt create genuine insecurity. But instead of a political response, for example, housing policy or stronger safety nets, people are told their financial struggle is due to personal irresponsibility. Why didn't you skip lattes and save for a down payment? Everyone else is managing. What's wrong with you? The policy choices that led to this are obscured by a fog of self-blame. Climate anxiety. The climate crisis is terrifying, yet governments and industries move slowly. Instead, individuals are inundated with tips to recycle more, take shorter showers, buy green products, as if carbon footprints were solely a personal moral failing. When one despairs that these small actions won't avert catastrophe, that despair is internalized. Maybe I'm just not hopeful or eco-conscious enough, rather than channeled into collective pressure on polluters. Social isolation. Loneliness and atomization are rampant, partly because community institutions, local clubs, public spaces, extended family support, have fractured under modern capitalism. Yet the lonely individual is likely to conclude there's something wrong with their social skills or worth. The solution offered is often an app or a new social media platform, which usually ends up commodifying connection even further, often deepening the sense of isolation. In each case, a crisis that really requires collective action and systemic change is recast as a personal homework assignment. And when, inevitably, you fail to solve a societal problem all on your own, you feel even more inadequate. It's a vicious loop. The worse things get, the more you blame yourself, and the more isolated and powerless you become. Fisher urges that we see this dynamic clearly. None of us, not even the most diligent, mindful, or privileged, can individually solve housing unaffordability, or precarious employment, or a whole climate crisis. Expecting individuals to carry what only structural change can lift is a recipe for widespread misery. Many have simply buckled under the terrifyingly unstable conditions of post-Fordism, Fisher writes, referring to workers damaged by deindustrialization and neoliberal policies. Yet the ruling ontology, the prevailing way of thinking, denies any possibility of a social causation of mental illness. We are systematically discouraged from connecting our personal pain to its actual sources. Instead, we hustle to adjust ourselves to an inhumane reality, meditating, exercising, swallowing pills, tweaking habits, treating the symptoms in isolation while the underlying causes churn out more distress. It's as if we are, in Fisher's words, very dedicated managers of a wound that someone else inflicted, breaking the isolation and finding meaning. Recognizing the structural nature of this malaise is an uncomfortable epiphany, but it can also be liberating. The first thing it offers is company in our suffering, the realization that you are not alone in feeling that objectless wrongness. If millions of people quietly suspect that something is off, then perhaps the problem was never just you. Fisher believed that simply naming the problem together is a radical act. When you voice these feelings to a friend, "I have this constant emptiness and I don't think it's only my fault," and they say, "I feel that too," the spell of private shame is broken, if only a little. Shared recognition is the first crack in the architecture of individualized suffering. Instead of pathologizing yourself, you start to see your unhappiness as evidence that the status quo is failing you and many others. That shift in perspective can spark something crucial: solidarity. Structural problems, unlike personal failings, can be addressed collectively. The more people come to this realization, the more possible it becomes to imagine doing something about the structure itself. But what does resisting such a sprawling system look like in practice? Fisher didn't offer easy utopias or one-size solutions. He knew the danger of falling into either naive optimism or nihilistic despair. Instead, he spoke of small communisms, modest, everyday acts that reintroduce collective care and meaning into our lives within the cracks of the system. These aren't grand political revolutions, but they are still significant. Examples include cooking a meal to share with neighbors with no transaction involved, organizing a book club or support group just for the fulfillment of it, tending a community garden, or creating art and hobbies that aren't for sale or for clout. In short, carving out spaces of life that run outside the market logic. In such spaces, friendship isn't networking, leisure isn't content, and value isn't measured in money or likes. Fisher appreciated these acts not because they instantly overthrow capitalism, but because they serve as rehearsals of a different way of living, however small. They momentarily suspend the logic of transaction and optimization, reminding us that humans can relate through care, gift-giving, and genuine presence rather than competition and self-interest. Each time you experience one of these non-capitalist exchanges, helping someone with no expectation of reward or enjoying an activity for its own sake, it's like a flash of reality breaking through the fog. The collective capacity to produce, care, and enjoy is something capitalism constantly tries to obstruct, but it's also something deeply natural to us. Reconnecting with it, even briefly, keeps alive the memory and possibility of an alternative way of organizing life. Another important form of resistance Fisher highlighted is reclaiming our sense of time and rhythm. In a culture that has dismantled every structure that once gave time its texture, we can recreate structure through personal or communal rituals. This doesn't necessarily mean religious practice, though it could for some, but any deliberate repetition that gives meaning outside of productivity. For instance, taking a walk every Friday at dusk to reflect on the week, or having a Sunday family dinner, or a weekly meetup with friends to make music or play games. Done not for social media posting or self-improvement, but just to mark time and be present. Such rituals act as anchors in the flow of endless, formless time that capitalist culture feeds on. They remind us we're not just cogs in a 24/7 machine. We are living beings moving through seasons, cycles, and shared moments. While these acts seem small, they accumulate into a subtle but real form of mental autonomy. They keep what Fisher called the part of you that can still feel the difference between real and simulated, between presence and performance, between a life and a lifestyle, alive. This inner compass, the gut sense that this is genuine and that is hollow, is easier to lose than we think. Keeping it sharpened is essential, because the capacity to imagine something different depends entirely on sensing that what we have now is not enough. If we become fully numbed, if we accept that hollow blur as normal, then we truly are trapped. Every dinner with friends that is just about the company, every hobby done just for joy, every mutual aid or community effort, these are not consumer experiences. They're small cracks in the facade of capitalist realism through which light can get in. They won't topple the system overnight, but they prevent the system from completely colonizing your spirit. And that is far from trivial. Your suffering is a signal, not a failure. Finally, Fisher asks us to confront the hardest truth of all. The nagging malaise you feel is meaningful. It is not proof that you're broken or not adapting well enough. It's proof that you refuse to fully adapt to an inhuman reality. In a culture that demands cheerfulness and adaptation, feeling wrong might actually be a form of clarity. The feeling that there's something fundamentally off is not a symptom of your failure to adjust, Fisher insists. It is a sane response to insane conditions. Everything we've explored, the lost futures, the commodified pleasures, the mediated unreality, the lonely struggles, these are the conditions. It is normal to feel exhausted and numb after carrying the weight of such a world on your individual shoulders your whole life. When the climate is collapsing, the economy is precarious, community is atomized, and every experience is sold back to you, not feeling okay would seem to be a logical reaction. As Fisher poignantly noted, many people on long-term stress and disability leave are in fact casualties of capital. Canaries in the coal mine of a system that wears people down and discards them. Yet rather than listen to the canaries, the system labels them defective. We are encouraged to view our pain as a personal defect to be fixed, rather than a signal that something out there is deeply wrong. What would happen if we, collectively, stopped automatically pathologizing ourselves and instead listened to the signal? If we all paused the frenetic scroll-consume-cope cycle long enough to say, "You feel it too, so it's real?" Perhaps we would begin to do what Fisher implored, repoliticize our distress. This doesn't mean politicize in a partisan sense, but in a structural sense, to connect the dots between private woes and public issues. For instance, rather than simply increasing our antidepressant dosage, we might also ask, what is it about our jobs, our cities, our social fabric that is making so many so depressed in the first place? Fisher notes that repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent task if we want to challenge the current system. Rather than just teaching individuals stress management, we might demand why working conditions are so stressful and unstable. These questions are uncomfortable for those in power, which is exactly why we're steered away from asking them. But the moment you realize your suffering might point to something larger, you can stop exhausting yourself trying to cure it in isolation. Instead of viewing your emotions as the enemy, you can recognize them as valid responses, even evidence that can guide you toward truth. None of this magically opens the prison door. As Fisher acknowledged, naming the cage does not open it. Seeing clearly can, in fact, be painful. It entails mourning those lost futures and admitting how much has been taken from us. But it also changes your relationship to the cage. You stop cooperating in your own diminishment. You stop accepting the verdict that every negative feeling is a personal failure. The energy that went into self-blame and futile self-fixing can be slowly redirected outward, towards understanding the world, towards connecting with others, towards small collective actions that rekindle meaning. You learn to trust your discontent rather than despise it. In doing so, you keep alive the capacity to desire a better reality. Fisher's work, as bleak as its analysis could be, was fundamentally loyal to the hope that we don't have to feel this way forever. He passed away in 2017 at the age of 48, but left behind a body of writing meant to tell everyone who ever felt this ambient despair, you were not wrong to feel it. The fact that millions of people feel the same vague ache, each convinced it's their private failure, is, as he wrote, the most important political fact of our moment. Recognizing that fact, together, is the first step toward change.